Hello, I'm the Immortal Angel, and this is my very first YouTube video. So if you're not familiar with me from TikTok, I like to do doll repaints, and some of my favorites are my Bionicle stuff, which as you can see coming in frame, we have Jala, then Takua. Then next we have an original character from me. Her name is Harley, and she looks different on purpose. Then we have Harley, who is slowly coming into frame. That's everyone that I've done so far, which are all Matoran, but there is one in particular that I am gonna show you on how I made her. The character that I chose particularly was Roodaka, one of my favorite villains. I mean, just look at her. Everyone sims after her, even this idiot, who falls for everything she says. Even with Roodaka being my favorite character, or favorite villain, she was extremely difficult for me to design a human form for. This is just what I managed to come up with that I was satisfied with. On first instinct, Cleo was probably the best choice, just based off of her skin tone. Except for one little thing. She's not curvy enough or tall enough for the character that I wanted to make. Because Harley here is taller than her, and I want Roodaka to be towering over the rest of them. So how to fix this issue? Well, we get Abby involved. She is the curviest and the tallest Monster High character to date. So these are our two dolls that I'm going to be using, body swapping them. But I'm not using the two that you see here. I have already prepped a head and the body as well. So with that out of the way, it is time to move on to the first step of what I did to complete this project. I start out with the head first to reroot it, and I'm using nylon hair from dolly.com. I have Mermaid and then Black Magic being the two colors that I am using. And of course, I got a rerooting tool from the same place. The first color that I am using is the Mermaid, which I am rerooting the hairline with it first because it's really only along the hairline, just starting at the temple or slightly above it before moving along the edge of it till I reach the other side of roughly the same place where I began. If that makes sense? I don't think it does. Either way, if you didn't notice, there is a embroidery needle that I've been stabbing essentially into the head. That's because I've been having issues with my rerooting tool. But as you can see, I have pins to mark out where I want specific blue strands in front of her head to be, and I am slowly moving out of frame. I got out of frame for this little portion, but I filled in the corners with more of the mermaid color for kind of dread-like looking parts of her hair. Of course, after all the blue is in, I started rerooting the black, finishing off the hairline before moving on to filling in the rest of the hair. And this is my first reroot with nylon doll hair. I've only ever worked with yarn before, so this took me forever, and it did not help that I started during the holiday season. But hey, at least it looks good, and I ended up using Elmo's glue because I had a bunch of it. So you just put it in through the neck hole thing, and I used a lot of this stuff because I was not sure how well it was gonna do. So I just poured in a bunch, used a brush to try to make sure that I touched all the plugs, while also squeezing it to, make sure that I did a decent job. And I added more. I added a lot into this, and I end up regretting it. Either way, set it off to dry. Next, we move on to the body, which is to remove Abby's molded on fur, which honestly, the first part of this, you can just skip over completely because it did not work, no matter how hard I tried. Which, if you don't know why I'm trying to use acetone to remove the fur, is because acetone is capable of melting certain type of plastics. It's just the plastic that they used for her arms and her legs are different from what they used for the rest of her body. I don't know why they did that, they just did. Which was annoying because I was hoping I could just melt it off instead of having to sand it or carve it down. But last, carving and sanding it down was probably the better choice to begin with. I just don't like having to sand stuff down. This was the point where I got fed up with trying to sand it and started to use an X-Acto knife to carve off most of it, which, be careful, they are sharp and always cut away from you. Next, I moved on to clothing. So this particular piece is the skirt. The back of it, it's in two parts, which I measured around Abby's waist with a ribbon to see how long it was gonna be, long enough to allow it to wrap around her with some space in the front. Of course, also keeping in mind how far I wanted to go down her. I want it to be not floor length, but just above it. The front piece is just a rectangle, the length to her ankles. And of course, after that, I drew a rough estimate of her corset and her top by tracing her body and then making the shapes that I wanted. After that, I gathered up all the fabrics and ribbons that I was going to use to make her outfit. Cutting out the pieces, as you can see, the bodice, I have a heart shape neckline. And of course, also keep in mind seam allowance as well. I'm going to focus on essentially her bodice, or I guess top, first, which I just placed in the area that I wanted it to, and I should have pinned it down because it would have made it so much easier. But I like to trace out the pattern on certain items if, I can see it, while also adding more seam allowance around the collar line of the shirt. After that, I end up folding the front of the pattern before essentially creating another one without having to use a piece of paper. So I just took the side of it, traced that, and then traced beneath it while adding a few inches more to it before adding another line slightly lower than the other to then connect it. So those are our pieces to make the bodice. Of course, cutting them out, and I end up folding the front to make sure that the sweetheart neckline was somewhat even, while also making sure seam allowance. I don't know why I'm so scared of not having enough room. I guess because I've made so many ones that were too small. Either way, I then test to see how well it fits on the body. Then, of course, I moved to cutting out her back and make sure that I have 2 pieces of these. And again, with a generous amount of seam allowance. After that, we're done with cutting out those pieces, and we can begin to start sewing them together. I also had cut out other pieces like the back of the skirt, and then I also took out the front as well. And knowing that, I ended up changing my mind. Either way, I began sewing, or pinning, I guess, the hemline for basically everything, which is just, tucking in and making sure that you can't see anything, while also sewing the sides together on the blouse. And I end up going over the stitchings a few times just to ensure that it won't tear apart as I put it on. And of course, sew hemlines and whatnot. Again, when I sewed the bodice, I ended up going over my stitches just in case. After I'm done hemming, that's when I put on the bodice to test to see how much room I have to work with when it comes down to, making sure that it stays in the back and how much I need to take in. So this is when I sew or hem the very edges of the back. And after I'm done with that, I also add in the snaps of the back so it can close. Of course, go and test it again to make sure that it still fits. And when I did it, it was a little tight because I had issues. And also me realizing that I should have tied back her hair when I put the head back on. And with it being so tight, I struggled getting it back on. Although I never fixed this problem, it is still very tight on her. Of course, I was also adjusting to make sure that it's at where I want it to be. And now I am making the sleeves. I didn't make a pattern immediately because I did not know exactly how I was gonna do it without, finding something that was flexible enough to measure it. So I just marked where I wanted things to connect and then just folded and pinned it with enough seam allowance for me to hem everything after I finalized the pattern or the piece. This is when I decided on how long I wanted it to be by holding it down in the place that I want to sew the sleeve onto before flipping her over and using a pen to mark how long or where I wanted to end at. Which in turn I, of course, snip enough to allow seam allowance before taking it off screen. To then finalize the piece that I want and then sew all the way around. And you see the final sleeve piece as I try to figure out how to attach it onto her tube top basically. Now I wanted the edges to be underneath the top, and as you can see the pin hassle, which of course to make sure that the sleeves are able to fit around the shoulders, you have to pin it while it's on the doll to make sure that it will fit. And of course sew it on directly. Then you will have the final, or have finished the shirt with, of course, the snaps. And, test it on the doll to make sure that it fits. It's a lot of testing, especially when you don't have reliable patterns and you make everything yourself. The next part of the shirt is this drapery thing. So take the length of the sleeve, put the doll to where the sleeve would end before drawing a line at the ankle. Then you need to draw a triangle shape to make this fabric or drapery off of the sleeve. Of course, after you're done, you need to cut it out. I like to fold it to make sure that it's even. And then, of course, I have this semi-translucent fabric that I've been wanting to use. And I end up cutting and sewing that off screen just because how annoying that fabric is to use. Of course, now after that's done, we're going to focus on the back of the skirt, which is just sewing all around it and then pinning both front and back pieces to each other while it is around the doll to make sure that it's a tight fit, because one side is only going to be sewn on, the other side is getting a snap to it so it can be removable without needing to slide down the body or having it in the back. Of course, this is when we add the snap, which I end up keeping the needle in while trying to sew it on, or at least to have it marked where I need the snap to go so I don't lose the spot where it needs to be so it can fit comfortably on the doll without it either sliding down or being too tight. The next part is her choker, which I just took a piece of ribbon and made sure that it could go around her neck with enough room for a snap to go. And don't mind the color is going to change with the next section that I dyed a lot of things, which the dye that I used, I ended up changing my mind because I wanted black, but that was the only thing that I had on hand. But I ended up going back and doing it. So I threw all the pieces that were completely black. And then I put the front of the skirt in, which I only wanted a fade to happen, which is why it's only partly in. Plus, it's also wet. Now, this was the pattern that I made for her gloves, which I used a piece of fabric to make it before moving on to ribbon, pinning it around, and sewing. Then, of course, we have the issue of, because I wanted to not have the fingers be painted, I end up wrapping a piece of thread around the middle finger a few times, though it may be better to use embroidery or a very small elastic, because it did not stay on there. The next part is the blue that's around her arm, which I measured before cutting 4 pieces out. After that, I ended up sewing it off camera just because how tiny it was, and I could only do it while the arms are on. And as you can see, I got a little too tight around one of them. This is when we move on to officially finishing the top by adding that drapery part to the sleeves. And now we're actually finishing the skirt by sewing the last part on. If I can get it off the doll first. I don't know why I had such a hard time. But as you can see, it is before I changed it to black, which it just dyed it a really dark gray. But I want it to be black, and it's really noticeable against the back of the skirt, just because it's completely black. And now I have the real issue, trying to make that stupid corset. I originally wanted to use the pleather, but the pleather would not, or I didn't cut it out long enough, and it wouldn't be that tight around to accentuate the curves. And with it being as thick as it was, it wouldn't do it. So ribbon was the best chance. And I ended up I tried sealing it in before giving up and just trying to sew it into the shape, which I lost a lot of the dramatic flair. Then, of course, the small ribbon. That thing was a pain to even pin, let alone sew. Because you have the 2 down the front, but you also have what's down the side. And I wanted the end of it to be underneath the ones down the side. Which eventually I ended up getting what I wanted, and that is what the finished piece looks like. And that's everything together. Now it is time for the head to go back on. I comb through the hair first just to get all the loose bits out before putting her back on the body. Which, as you can see, I did not succeed putting her head back on without issues. I think the problem was the length of my needle had a lot of hair inside the head, which meant the whole neck peg could not go in, so I trimmed it and managed to get it back on. Now it is time for the head burrito to seal in the face so I can start drawing, which I don't have Mr. Super Clear, I just have this clear acrylic spray. And as you can see, my materials, I blushed the face to breathe in some life. And I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to try to do the pastel makeup first, but I ended up just going over it with paint, which my biggest mistake was trying to do that black lipstick with pastel. And yeah, immediately moved over to paint pretty quickly. Her makeup just mainly consists of the same blue as practically everything else as her top lip and some red at the bottom. Painting in the whites of her eyes, building that up before painting in her actual eye color, which is, of course, same blue as everything else. And if you haven't noticed, I painted her legs already, just trying to find a good blend of color. Doing her black lipstick before finally moving on to doing her eyeliner. Adding some lashes, then her pupils, which are, I guess, cat eye. Adding some touches, and then adding the highlights. And I painted the body off camera and just added, of course, all the blushing, which you can't even see half of it. Painted her nails black, and then sealed the body in, even though in the end it still did not save the legs from peeling. It never does, no matter what I do. Next, I am adding in some little hoops to the corset and the choker, which I just use embroidery threads to make a hole before sliding it in, which there are about 6 of these. 2 in back, 2 in front of the corsets, and then 2 at the side of the choker, which I took blue embroidery thread and these beads that I found, I believe, at Joann's, and just string them onto the thread and get enough to make a loop to the other loop at the front of the skirt or corset. And there are 3 layers of these on both sides. Each layer will progressively get longer than the other. Once all 3 layers are on, you need to tie the ends of them to the loops. I repeat the same motion for the choker, which I add about 3 other necklaces to. The first one, the smallest, being made out of the same beads as what's on the hips. And then a second one with smaller, sparkly black beads, which are so tiny I had to change out my needle. I did not film this part, but I used resin for a gem in the middle of her choker and the piece of permodermis that she has in her chest for the movie. These shoes are from Rainbow High's fashion pack. They were kind of the only ones that would fit Abby's feet. So I first took off all the strappings to make it less ballerina, which I end up showing you 2 ways to do it. One with the X-Acto knife to cut off them, and then with wire cutters to cut them off. Although they aren't as seamless as what the X-Acto knife is. And of course I cut off the bows and paint them black, because almost everything on this doll is black. Although I did take a little inspiration from Hextian and gave her Louboutin heels. The final product of the heels, which I am actually kind of proud of. You know, they don't quite fit on her feet like I thought they would. And her hair, it was a nightmare. I did most of it off camera, but it's just putting her hair in a high ponytail while keeping the sides out. Roodaka has kind of like these dread-like designs at the side of her head, which I tried to recreate by tying off like plugs, which did not work. I later ended up having to do clumps, which I did 5. I tied it 3 times before cutting them off at the ends. Now, it would have been easier to do braids or twists, and of course, trim off excess, which you can have her hair be shorter than this. I thought keeping it long was fabulous. I love how long the hair is. Now she is complete, and here is a mini little photo shoot that I did. Well, that's the end of this video, and I am super happy with how Roodaka turned out, especially because she kept very close to my concept art, despite all the minor inconveniences. Either way, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I will see you in whenever I post the next one. Bye! Let me out. Are you gonna let me